AWS made major announcements at reInvent, including the Nova 2 family of models and Sonic for speech, as well as emerging AI factories featuring Trainium custom silicon and S3 vector storage as they try to stake a claim in the AI infrastructure market. Companies like AWS are building deep infrastructure capabilities, and platforms like SageMaker and Bedrock are delivering AI powered applications, as are companies like Google and Microsoft. IBM also made waves this week with their announced acquisition of Confluent, which is yet another modern AI application arrow in the quiver of Big Blue. And Nvidia told us a little bit more about how to use a mixture of experts designs to increase performance. All that and more on this episode of Utilizing AI. Welcome to Utilizing AI, the podcast focused on practical applications of artificial intelligence from the Futurum Group. Each episode brings together diverse perspectives to explore news and use cases in the ways in which AI is transforming enterprise IT and the industries it serves. I'm your host, Stephen Foskett, president of the Tech Field Day business unit here at the Futurum Group. And before we get started with today's discussion, let's meet who's joining me on the panel today.
Stephen, thanks for having me. Hi, everyone. Brad Shimmin. I'm an analyst with the Futurum Group looking at data intelligence, analytics, and infrastructure.
And I'm Nick Patience. I'm the AI platforms practice lead at Futurum, focused solely on AI, really.
And as mentioned, I'm Stephen Foskett from the Tech Field Day business unit. I host the AI Field Day events and, of course, this podcast. I have to actually say I'm here at the New York Horological Society, which is hosting me. And if you're wondering what that is, Google it. It's amazing. So let's dive right in. I'm surrounded by antiquities here, but we've got a lot of cool, modern, ultra cool stuff happening here in the future. We just got done with AWS reInvent. Now, we're not a news podcast, and we don't want to make it sound like we're, kind of reporting the latest. But Nick and Brad, you all have had some time now to digest the announcements from reInvent. Perhaps you can regurgitate a little bit of that knowledge. I'm going to not stretch this metaphor anymore. Nick, what was announced at reInvent, and what was interesting to you?
So yeah, we Brad and I were there last week, and we wrote a note for Futurum clients. I actually wrote the headline, and the headline was "Wrestling Back AI Leadership," and I think that kind of sums up where we are at the end of 2025. It's been, I guess, fairly well known that Google, at least from a narrative point of view, has kind of taken a bit of a lead out of the three major hyperscalers. And AWS uses reInvent every year to make its major announcements, obviously. This was more about that. So I guess one of the things were the Nova 2 family of models, including there was Nova 2 Pro for advanced reasoning, our Omni for long context workloads, and then Sonic, which was a speech to speech model, which was pretty impressive, that last one. And because Amazon AWS rather has its contact center applications, which embeds, which some well-known content center apps out there are built on, and I think that's is obviously a real proving ground for that kind of stuff. So I think I certainly believe it's fair to say that Amazon wasn't at the cutting edge of models, and Nova was announced at last year's reInvent. This is Nova 2. And these are strong models, but I think that each one of these kind of vendors are going to find a niche there. I think the other interesting thing I thought was the AI factories, which is essentially the Amazon's infrastructure in the client's data center. And as part of that, they announced the Trainium Ultra servers based on Trainium 2. They also announced Trainium 3, the chip, and then the roadmap for 4. So it's very much, I think, from my point of view anyway, it looked like Amazon and AWS trying to own the kind of AI infrastructure narrative, at least. There's lots of other things, and there's lots of other things they announced, and maybe, Brad, you can talk about a couple of the others.
Yeah, for me, just building on what you're talking about with Nova, we all know that AWS is not going to outdo Anthropic and even really Google with the Gemini family in terms of outright performance. And I have to admit that when we first got to the show and they were talking about everything being frontier scale, with a capital F and air quotes around it. I was a little, taken aback and thought, nah, come on, guys, you're not really doing frontier scale models. You're just ruining the name. And it's really not true. They're actually building frontier scale models in terms of being multimodal as one checkbox, in having super long context windows at 1 million tokens, another checkbox. And and I think that when you look at that, coupled with another announcement that came out, and that is their what they called Amazon Nova Forge, which is this basically a facility and set of tools, of what Amazon likes to call recipes, that you can use to fine tune the Nova family of models, and not just in your basic, here's the open weights models. Good luck. Because we've been doing that for years now in terms of fine tuning and instruct tuning and aligning models during the training process and after that. And what they're doing is kind of unique in that they're productizing, operationalizing those mechanisms, those data science techniques, to make them a lot more accessible to the enterprise marketplace. And they're opening up the Nova models to actually let you sort of work with those as though they were your own. So they're letting companies basically grab different checkpoints. Checkpoints are steps along the way to creating this final frontier model, so that companies can more readily bring their own data to those models. And that's pretty cool. And very quickly, I want to say one other thing that really caught my attention. And this is, again, me being dragged forward because, I'm a database guy, and I think database management systems are kind of important. And yet, we are seeing a very sizable trend in the industry towards pushing down database functionality to the storage layer itself. And on Amazon, it's the AWS S3 layer, so your object storage. And they released it to GA, their AWS S3 vectors capability, which is, as you might imagine, a vector database, one that can do, super huge indexing tasks and do so at scale with a comparatively very small cost footprint, which is quite impressive. And one of the reasons why you might want to push that functionality down to the S3 layer. And if you couple that with an announcement they made earlier in the year around S3 tables, which is basically to bring structured data to the, non-structured nature of object storage, you've got yourself kind of a database, disguised as a file system. So it's really interesting times.
So just picking up, Brad, on the Nova Forge thing, I think you're right. I think that is at the moment unique. You could do that, couldn't you? In like Google Model Garden and things like that, you could tie it all together. And Microsoft, you could do the same thing, and maybe IBM as well. But I think do you think, I kind of think this will be copied by the others, by its direct rivals pretty within, I would be surprised if it takes them more than a couple of quarters, but they will do it. But for now, it's the only sort of productized way of doing what they're trying to do, isn't it?
Yeah, everything else has been data science. Open up a Jupyter notebook and grab your favorite PyTorch version and have at it. And that's not something that's accessible to every company.
So
at least
if I can ask your opinion,
experience. Yeah.
Let me ask your opinion on the direction that AWS is going here, and what we can learn from that. I see something of a similarity as well. You mentioned Google, of course. They have a similar approach to this. Am I reading this wrong, or are they seeing, companies like AWS and Google that have a huge infrastructure capex investment? Are they seeing models as almost a loss leader to attract people to their environments, or to enable the build out of this new industry, which I guess that could be a second point? Or are they seeing these as products that they will make revenue from?
I personally think it's the former. I've always thought it's the former, really, that the models are not the application, models are not the product. They are very much a means to an end. They get the attention, as Brad knows. Every single time any major company releases a model, journalists will always be asking us about that, and sometimes I'm kind of wishing they'd ask us something about something else. But I think they are very much a loss leader, and then you build the value around that, either below it with silicon or on top of it with the various tools and then applications. I don't know what you think, Brad.
Yeah, I feel the same way. We were just talking about it before we came on air that, whether you can believe this or not, but has been studied and argued that perhaps, the further we get with the transformer architecture, the less differentiation we're going to see between, frontier scale models and actually all scaled models, simply because they all converge around the same patterns that they're trained on. So, yeah, is Nick's totally right. It's really just a part of the tool chain, and it's an important part, but it is just one. And we have seen a lot of effort from all of the vendors that we've been talking about in terms of trying to at least standardize on how you interact with those models from an API perspective, so that whatever tooling I'm using in that tool chain, I can bring in the model that's most cost, performant, accurate, efficient for me.
Mm. I mean, that's not to say at the moment, Google, for instance, with Gemini, and that's the only place you can get hold of Gemini, the model that is, does have, that kind of appeal. And I think it waxes and wanes. I mean, everybody's got a model garden, a model switchboard. I like to think, how may I direct your prompt? Do you want this model, that model? So that ability to offer first and third party models usually isn't much of a differentiator, unless your model is something quite spectacular. And I think the kind of window for being spectacular could last days, maybe weeks, if you're lucky, and then it slams shut.
So what does this mean for the rest of the industry then? If models are loss leaders, what does this mean for companies like Anthropic and OpenAI? And I have an idea. I think that Anthropic and OpenAI are trying. They don't. So let's back up again. So AWS and Google understand that infrastructure has always been where the money is, the revenue, the bulk of the revenue. And I think that a product like S3, for example, is a very sticky revenue magnet in a way that very few things in our industry are. And so it makes wonderful sense that Amazon would want companies to have more data in S3 to make S3 more AI friendly and attract people to using Amazon's infrastructure to build their applications. I think that OpenAI and Anthropic, it looks like what they're trying to do is instead build a platform. You mentioned sort of that app store kind of approach. I think that's kind of where those guys are going. Or am I missing that point as well? And is Amazon playing there too?
Yeah, I think yes, I think they are. I mean, OpenAI, I think, is trying to build a completely vertically integrated technology company, from chips through all the software layers we've talked about, to devices, and everything. You're working with Johnny Ive and all that kind of stuff, and everything in between. And then Anthropic, to a slightly lesser extent, but still, they're building out tools. So I think they're trying to build new software companies essentially. Whether they will succeed or not, we will see, and we'll be trying to track it very very closely. But I think that's what they're trying to do anyway. That's my opinion, Brad.
Yeah, I feel the same way in terms of, these companies have been for quite some time trying to build beyond the model itself. And you look at how Anthropic Claude family has evolved in that regard, and you can see that what they've been focusing on is how do you build the attendant tooling around, using their models? How do you get from just a chatbot to a full-fledged agentic process running in your line of business? That's where they're building for, and that means, as Nick just said, they're building out a platform. Everybody's got a platform.
So that sounds more like a Salesforce or a ServiceNow kind of play, as opposed to more of a traditional enterprise tech kind of play.
And you asked about AWS, and are they kind of trying to do that? Yeah, I mean, SageMaker has hundreds of thousands of customers, and has been around for a very long time. And Bedrock seems to be doing pretty well as well. So I think they all are doing it. It's obviously leads to it's sticky, isn't it? It leads to getting out of those platforms once you're in them, to that level of depth. And S3 is the best example, isn't it? I mean, the first kind of the first cloud storage product around. And when you talk privately to some people from some of these companies, it's like anything we can do to get people to, put more stuff on S3, or in Google's case, use BigQuery, which is a very successful product, is an absolute is a kind of motherlode for them. So I think they're all trying it. Microsoft's slightly interesting, and maybe the canniest one in some ways, because obviously it outsourced the development of the models to OpenAI, and it's now sitting there as an investor on a potentially eventually one day some sort of great exit. Meanwhile, it's got obviously its own software, stacks and franchises, if you will, which dominate the corporate world. So it's it all takes slightly different approaches, but I think largely they're all trying to do that as well.
It's funny, isn't it, that Microsoft has a number of times in its history been that sort of wait and then pounce kind of approach, instead of trying to be the one on point, taking the fire.
Don't buy a Microsoft product until version 3 type thing sometimes.
Yeah, definitely not 11.
Yeah, I mean, but you look at how far they've come with Azure. I mean, I'm old enough to remember, and I think you guys are as well, that in the cloud wars, Azure was seen as sort of an afterthought. Oh, really, Microsoft? Yeah, you're going to bring Windows to, you're going to bring a knife to a gunfight here. Well, nobody's laughing now, because Azure was so incredibly enterprise and developer focused that they were able to build it into essentially, I don't know if it's a bigger business than their traditional Windows business, but it is a monster. And I think they're trying to do the same in AI, right?
Yeah, I'd say so. And I think it's and you can say the same thing about Google. Even at the beginning of 2025, people were saying, that's not a serious enterprise play. And now look at it we're honest, in the space of 12 to 18 months. So yeah, I think it is I think it waxes and wanes. That's what makes it interesting. That's what keeps us in a job, basically, isn't it, as well?
Indeed. And the waxing and waning, by the way, I just want to pause for a second there to honor the fact that if you do invest in a given model maker, that can be the most beneficial and frustrating aspect of that at the same time, because it's every time there's a new model that comes out. So every time we go from 4.0 to 4.5 to 5.1 with OpenAI, for instance, the models are a different employee. They become a different beast that you have to contend with, and you may have perfectly running workflows that you've spent months painstakingly building towards something that they do exactly what you want, and next day they don't. It is crazy.
Sorry, Nick, was that yes that you do have something to say about reInvent, or yes that you want me to? Okay, I'm sorry.
I think we're done with reInvent.
I sense a transition point that will work. So here we go. So, you talk about companies like Microsoft, who are seen as sort of, I don't want to say stodgy, but sort of, they're coming later. They're more enterprise focused. They're more, more of a traditional IT vendor. But there's, of course, a big daddy traditional IT vendor that made some waves this week as well. And frankly, there again, I feel like the market, the zeitgeist isn't right when it comes to IBM, because you say those three letters to a lot of people and they immediately go, oh, mainframe. Well, yes, mainframes still exist and they're still relevant, but that is not IBM. And IBM this week made huge waves, if it's possible to make waves outside of an AI announcement. They made huge waves with the announcement that they are going to be acquiring Confluent, which is a company that maybe not everybody's familiar with. But they're acquiring Confluent. And those of us who are kind of insiders in the industry were like, oh, yeah. Like, I feel like the Kool-Aid man here. I'm like bursting through the wall saying, this is such a great move for IBM. But I think most normal people would be listening to this saying, what? So first off, what's your reaction to Confluent and IBM? And second, this isn't about AI, or is it?
It is totally about AI. And yeah, $11 billion of any sort is a big splash, is it not? And the fact that they paid this much for a company that basically built its business on top of a very well-known, but nonetheless, a piece of open source software in Kafka, which is a streaming service. says a lot. And what it says is that IBM gets infrastructure, and that's like my top level takeaway from that. And you can see this acquisition building on the HashiCorp acquisition they made earlier this year, and all of that says infrastructure as code, code as infrastructure. And if you're going to build AI, you're going to need to be able to architect something that can be hosted and scaled anywhere, any cloud provider, any premises, et cetera. And you're going to want something that you can orchestrate in the most effective manner. And by orchestrate, I mean bringing data to AI. And that's what this Confluent acquisition is all about. We've been building AI systems with context windows and supplementing those, and supplementing the training of the model with context window data, like through RAG pipelines and such. And that's great. And it can bring, you're not going to be indexing that stuff instantaneously, but if instead you could bring data in real time to the models as they are going about their business, and also bring data out of those models, especially in an agentic workflow, that's going to mean whether or not you can actually build and succeed with an idea that you have as a company. If you're going to build with AI, you need to be thinking about not just static data that gets fed in through the context window. You need to be thinking about streaming data in real time.
Yeah, excellent put. This is Brad's area very much. He's the expert here, but I think it will be interesting to see how it kind of ties into the Watson X .ai story. And I think they're kind of the messaging around there is sort of getting it's getting stronger, but I think it may change a little bit. And the orchestrate product as well. So it's very much, it did remind me of HashiCorp, different use case and different technology. But similar, IBM has always had a formidable AI M&A machine. I remember at an analyst event, it was well over a decade ago, we got to sit with their M&A team. I remember and sit there, and they were basically telling us, like, we're around this table, let's imagine as if we were going to buy a company, a made up company, and this is how they go through all the due diligence. And it's quite a process, and it's quite something to see, and good to see it's still executing.
Yeah, they're definitely looking ahead. Wouldn't you say, Stephen? They're definitely looking for the long play here in terms of not being a hyperscaler, in terms of having data gravity, but instead being a hyperscaler in terms of having an infrastructure that can run anywhere and enable anything.
The thing as well that IBM does so well is, at least in modern times, under this current administration, not so much in the past, but in this current administration at the company, is run these things well in a way that doesn't run off customers, that is actually accumulating customers and bringing people into the fold instead of excluding them from it. And I think that we've seen that certainly with Red Hat. We've seen that with HashiCorp. Another acquisition I want to bring in here that I think is parallel here. You're talking, Nick, about basically the great big acquisition machine. All of these acquisitions rhyme, essentially. IBM is looking for companies that have just incredible recurring revenue, that have customers that all can come into IBM fresh and expand within the IBM portfolio of products. But they recently purchased DataStax as well, which is another incredible open source. I mean, maybe not so high profile, but an open source purveyor for enterprise customers of an Apache product. Brad, DataStax plus Apache Kafka. I mean, how does this work?
Yeah, like Nick said, it's all about enabling the Watson X portfolio. So Watson X AI, Watson X data, Watson X governance, all of that is benefiting from every one of these acquisitions. And to my mind, it isn't so much about what these products do, what these technologies do, because you can get Kafka from anybody. I can rook up on GCP and
You get it for
Azure.
free. It's open source, baby.
Right, but I mean, like, managed hosted. This is what Confluent makes its money on,
Yeah.
is managed hosted, right? And yet, what is really interesting to me about these acquisitions that we're talking about is that each of them have a very well regarded and global ecosystem that is mature. And I would say, like, if I was to look back at IBM over the last 5 to 7 years and say, what's their biggest weakness? It would be lack of ecosystem. I mean, think about what drives the value of Azure that we've been talking about. It's not the greatness of the software, it's the breadth and commitment of the ecosystem that builds on it and for it. Not just the Git and but it is, right? It's huge.
So if I can break in with a timely quote to those of us old enough to have seen the film, it reminds me of Han Solo. Luke Skywalker says, that hunk of junk. And Han Solo says, who's going to fly it, kid? You? Well, that's IBM, right? That's Red Hat. That's, what's going on here. Yeah, you can do this, but who's going to run it? Well, we are. We're going to run it in a way that works. And frankly, that has been a very compelling argument for these companies. Now, another thing that I want to bring in here, hopefully without any more Star Wars quotes, is Nvidia, of course. Now, I have been really excited about some of the models that Nvidia has developed. Parakeet absolutely rocks. I think I mentioned that recently. But Nvidia is out now with a mixture of experts models. Tell us a little bit more about that, Nick.
Yeah, it's not supposed to. We were talking about the models and the efficiency of models earlier, but they're talking about techniques in which to optimize mixture of experts models. And they put out a blog post last week, I think. I thought it was interesting. They were talking about how 60% of AI of open source AI models released this year are let's call it MOE, so we don't have to spell it out every time, but mixture of experts models. And this is kind of taking over from kind of dense transformers. But there's problems with those in terms of memory bandwidth pressure, and this is on their H200 systems they're talking about. So on their own GPUs, there are limitations around memory bandwidth from constantly loading all the expert parameters, and then communication latency when experts are distributed across more than 8 GPUs. So they were looking for a way to solve this problem. And is there NVLink technology? So they call this the GB200 NVL72, which connects 72 Blackwell GPUs and delivers. I'm not going to go through all the numbers, but it's very quick, and it enables it gets rid of the bottleneck by distributing the experts across up to 72 GPUs, reducing the number of experts on each GPU, and that relieves the pressure on the memory. And so given the essentially that MOEs are the kind of the way that everything's working now, or at least this is the models that are going to be rolled out. They're looking for obviously ways to optimize the infrastructure on their infrastructure, and of course with their NVLink technology. Actually, interesting on the was it Trainium 3 or 4 is going to have the AWS ones is going to have NVIDIA NVLink in it as well. And so I thought it was just quite interesting how we can, because in the early days of the transformer models, we're obviously talking about how these models obviously cost an enormous amount of money to train, and that's partly because of the parameters, the way the parameters work, the way the data constraints work, and the MOE is sort of becoming kind of the standard way of building frontier models. And there's very specific reasons why you would use other niche models, and there's like obviously diffusion and things like this. But I think it's interesting. It's obviously it's self-serving for NVIDIA to say use our infrastructure, use our HP200s, and use this NVLink 72. But it's interesting. I think how they and they claimed. I should have mentioned they claimed it was 10 times performance increase. I should have probably put that higher up in my little ramble. But I thought it was worth mentioning anyway, because anything that can optimize these things is going to be of interest to a lot of model trainers. And as we were talking about earlier, there's still a lot of those around.
Yeah, we're in the scale out era, are we not? And that optimization is going to make or break investments in data center as well as individual projects. And the skeptic in me, by the way, Nick, wants to see them do this comparison on a chip that isn't 3 years old. you know. But so it is like you said, it is a bit self-serving, but I think they're bringing up some really important points that the architecture of these models really dictates what you can do in terms of scale out and up with these things. If you have the greatest model in the world, but it sucks so much VRAM just to set it up and you can't scale it across clusters, how much concurrency are you going to get out of it? And by the way, it's not just big models. I know IBM with their Granite models. They like a month or so ago. Remember that they released a mixture of experts that's like under 4 billion parameters that is meant to do the same, to bring the same benefits of an MOE to on device inferencing. That's awesome.
Yeah, they're doing a lot of work with small language models at IBM, aren't they? It's a very important differentiator for them as they see it.
Well, I've just accidentally demonstrated the power of mixture of experts models by revealing that I didn't know what this story was all about and calling in an expert who did, which is exactly what see, I meant to do that.
You routed.
I routed it properly. I wonder, Nick, does this have anything to do with the rising price and lowered availability of RAM? There's kind of a RAM crisis right now.
I'm not a RAM expert, but I think it probably does. It has just and also just in terms of squeezing the most out of the assets that are out there. Obviously, there's shortages of all sorts of things, including GPUs themselves, and so I think it's they were talking specifically about performance per watt, and then being able to, like in Nvidia language, then being able to generate more tokens from your AI factory. These are all the terminology they like to use. But if you can get a 10 times increase in performance per watt, that's extremely important in these kind of power constrained and GPU constrained times in which we live.
Indeed, the data center is limited by the number of watts that it can consume. And by the way, I understand that RAM shortage is down to one individual named Altman, Mr. as in.
Are you trying to say that he doesn't have a good brain, or are you trying to say
that he bought up silicon?
I know.
Sorry,
his memory's not what it was. No, he's got the best memory. All right. Well, on that note, thank you very much. I'm going to have to route that query to another expert here at Futurum to find out more about that hardware crisis. Thank you both for joining us for this week's episode of Utilizing AI. I have to say, our producer just ran the numbers, and we've got some great viewership already with this new podcast. Thank you, everyone, for listening. Please do drop us a line if you're watching. I know you are, because we can see the metrics. So we would love to hear from you. You can find me on LinkedIn as S. Foskett. Brad, Nick, where can we find you? Brad?
Yeah, Brad Shimmin on LinkedIn and on the Futurum site itself.
Nick Patience on LinkedIn and on Twitter X, and I'm on Blue Sky. And all of our stuff is published on futurumgroup.com.
Excellent. And again, thank you to the Horological Society of New York for hosting me here today in their beautiful library in Manhattan. And thank you for listening to this episode of Utilizing AI. If you enjoyed this discussion, again, please subscribe. You'll find us on YouTube as well as in your favorite podcast application. And do consider giving us a rating and a review, since that helps visibility for all podcasts. This podcast is brought to you by the analysts and experts from the Futurum Group, where insight meets AI. For show notes and more episodes, head over to techstrong.ai, which is our AI news site, the Utilizing AI YouTube channel, or the Techstrong TV app on your TV or smart device. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you next week.